Uh, no, in all seriousness, all seriousness though, it's 9:30 on the back, so we'll go ahead and begin. I would like to remind everyone, if you have an announcement, write it legibly and as large as possible, and give it to Marty Baker. He's doing our announcements this morning. Chris is under the weather today. I think he caught what his children had. But I do believe he was supposed to be out of town this weekend, so I definitely had a little more. I have more than an hour and a half notice this week. So before we begin, though, let's say a word of prayer. Father in heaven, we come before Thee, giving thanks for this opportunity to study Your Word in this Lord's Day that we've been given the privilege to come and worship You. Father, we ask that You be with us during our study, and that the things that we pull from Your text we might use to glorify You in our lives. Father, we ask that You be with those who are hurting and who are struggling in the congregation, Father, and ask that Your hand of comfort and healing be upon them. It's through Your Son's precious name we pray. Amen. All right, so the title of this week's class is Thou Art But a Youth. And this was taken from what was said to David when he came to fight Goliath. That was the excuse that they gave him. Thou art but a youth. You're too young. And so you probably wonder why we're going to have this class in this particular setting rather than having it in the youth class, the high school and the teenage class. And I think the topic of youth is important for us regardless of our age. Even those of us that youth has come and gone, youth is still a prominent subject that we can focus on and that we can learn from. And we'll look at that here in just a moment. When we think of David, particularly when he fought Goliath, without thinking about it, just kind of what do you picture David as? Or we can even just take it a step further. If you see it depicted in art, what does David look like?
Gladiator.
What's that?
Gladiator.
A gladiator? Okay. Small, okay. A young boy, right? Usually he looks like a 12 preteen child, essentially. And he went against David in that sense. There's a song that basically makes the point, "Oh, a little boy David, and 5 little stones he took." That's what they sing in the cradle roll type classes. And this really isn't a fair representation of David. And I know when we talked about David and Goliath, we talked about the point that Saul was a large man. They estimated him to be about 6'4", a grown man, and armor is custom fitted to an individual. So there is at least something about David's stature that made Saul think giving David his armor would have been useful. Okay, so that would in and of itself indicate that David was probably a little bit older than the preteen boy that we often associate with him. More than likely, David was probably in the age of 20 to 25 years old when he fought Goliath. And that's not an arbitrary number. We can't know for certain how old he was, but there is, I would say, a good educated guess to determine that. Look at it from an external standpoint or secular standpoint. Scholars suggest, and again, we can't know it for sure, but again, this is based on some evidence that tends to lead us to believe this. Scholars suggest that David died around 1015 BC, and when he died, he was about 70 years old. Okay? We know David reigned for a total of 40 years. He reigned for 33 years over the entire nation of Israel, Israel and Judah. Before that 33 years, though, he reigned as the king over Judah, while Saul reigned over the remainder of the tribes. So that's where the 40-year reign comes from. Before that, before he became king of Judah, there was a period of time where he was being hunted by Saul. Most scholars believe that that was a 10-year period. I forgot what source I was reading. Some say that it could have been about a 5-year period at the least, but more than likely that was a 10-year period. That pursuit of Saul and David was about a 10-year period. So you got 70 minus 40, which will put him at the age of 30 when he became king over Judah, 37 when he became the king over the United Kingdom. But if we take 10 years from that age 30, then he would have been in that 20 to 25 year range. So that's where we get that from. That's secular history. Okay? There's biblical history that would tend to lend itself to support that number, 20 to 25 years old. Why was, if you open your Bibles to 2 Samuel chapter 17, why was David outraged? Remember the whole circumstance around David fighting Goliath was Jesse sent him to take provisions to his brothers and then bring back a report to Jesse on how things were going. And he arrives at the camp, and what's happening? Goliath comes out every day and taunts the children of Israel. And so David's issue was what? All right, and the taunt was, send your best and my best, whoever wins. The others will be the slaves of the victors. And David's issue with that is what? He was being disrespectful to the army of God, but that was part of it. The other part of it was that no one from the army of God was going out to fight the guy. And so there's the spiritual outrage that he had. In this instance, from a biblical standpoint, probably shows a little bit more maturity on David's part than a 12-year-old kid. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I don't think a 12-year-old would have that type of mentality at that time. And I'm just reflecting back to myself when I was 12. I wouldn't have that kind of courage or disdain for somebody who was doing that. Personal ambition. Look at verses 25 through 27. Did I say, I'm sorry, let's go to 1 Samuel chapter 17. I said 2 Samuel, I think. And if I didn't, I turned to the wrong one. Verse 25, and the men of Israel, have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel. Verse 26, and David said to the men who stood by him, what shall be done for the man who kills the Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him in the same way, so shall it be done for the man who kills him. All right, so Saul offers a reward of what for the man who kills Goliath? His daughter in marriage, great riches, and no taxes for his house. How many 12-year-olds care about marriage, money, or taxes?
Boys, for sure.
Exactly. Exactly. I can tell you for a fact, my 15-year-old now, doesn't care about money. She asks for whatever it is she wants, and money is not an object, right? She definitely doesn't care about taxes. And fortunately, she's not really into dating too. So a 12-year-old is not going to be thinking about those things. David's thinking about these things. This is appealing to David. And when I go back to 20 years old, that's about the time I started to really care about girls, money, and taxes. When they were taking my taxes, it made me angry, and I understood that I was spending my own money on things. So things, I still to this day don't know how my parents kept up with our grocery bill while I was growing up. So I was a little more frugal and was willing to eat a lot cheaper food when I was buying it for myself. So, but again, that wasn't my thought at 12 years old. And then we see in verse 33 of this. So he's taken this concern, and Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against the Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth." All right, so even though David was probably 20, 25 years old, he was still looked at as too young for that moment. Okay? But that was Saul's opinion of him. Okay, so what I want to do here is just take a break, and I want to look at youth in the Bible. Okay? Because I think what we're going to find is that God doesn't look at youth the same way we do. I would argue that youth, and when I say youth, I'm going to say maybe the preteen, the later part of the preteen years, 11, 12 years old, even into maybe the early 20s. We'll categorize it as that. I would argue that's probably the hardest part of life. Now, I'm only speaking at that from a 40-year-old man's perspective. Some would argue that maybe the latter end of life is more difficult. But just from my experience, I would say the youth portion is. There's a balance in that 12 to 20-something-year-old range where you're seeking your independence. You're starting to want to make decisions for yourself, but at the same time, you have to depend on somebody. And so there's that frustration. You want to do things your way, but at the same time, you're not in a position to do things your way, so you have to submit to those who, and it seems like during those years, the wisdom that the parents are trying to impart, there's less trust in it during those years than even the beginning years, the young child, toddler to young child age. And even when I got out of the house and got married, and it became older and was making decisions for myself, I started to understand my parents' wisdom from a better perspective. But that point, that 12 to 21, 22-year-old range is a difficult time, I think, in most people's lives. So, but from that standpoint, are there advantages to youth? I woke up this morning, went to the gym, and my ribs were hurting a little extra today than they have been in the past. It's a long time ago. I fell a long time ago. I saw my daughter, my 8-year-old, fall at the same time, and she's running around like nothing's happened. Here I am. I can't even sneeze without it being painful. Okay, so there's some advantages to youth. There's some things about youth that we long for. What are some things that you would say bring an advantage from a youthful standpoint? Our youth brings.
They're so trusting.
What's that?
They're so trusting.
Okay, absolutely. There is a different, they have not been worn down by life and become cynical.
They're not responsible for their everyday living, their parents are.
Right, you're right.
That makes a lot of difference.
Right, and there's probably more gratitude. Not necessarily gratitude, but trustworthiness, which we could learn from. right? I would argue that we should lean on God the way that our youth leans on us as parents. So very good. Any others? Y'all don't want to state the obvious. Forgiveness, very good. That is, they don't hold grudges as long as maybe adults do. All right, I'm going to say energy. All right, they have more energy than we do. Okay, I mean they can go. Gemma, I'll go to bed late and I'm still hearing her rustle around, and I'll get up after her and she's in there rustling around and can go through the day and all that. There's just energy involved with youth that seems to dissipate the older we get. What about risk? All right, there's more. They're more daring. They're probably less concerned with. I'll put it like this: they're more focused on the potential of something rather than the risk of something. I guess to say they're more concerned with the opportunities than they are the risks.
They're less concerned with the future.
Right. They are less concerned with the future.
Or the circumstances.
And that's a great point. And what did Jesus say? Don't worry about tomorrow. Tomorrow will take care of itself. Worry about today. I think the youth probably do that better than we as older people do as well.
Back to the stress of the everyday taking care of the youth
Right.
that we have.
Right. No, that's a great point. And even if they do have a vision of the future, there's ingenuity, in my opinion, with the youth. Older we get, the more set in our ways we tend to become. And so there tends to be more innovation. At least, working in the secular world, the younger out of college, the company hadn't beat them down as long as it had the veterans. And so what happened? They come in and they got this vigor, this mindset of innovation, this ingenuity to them to try and make things better. And so they're willing to learn new things. They're willing to take on challenges that sometimes as we get older we may not be willing to do. So a lot of advantages to the youth. Solomon would say, remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the evil days come and the years draw near when you will say, I have no pleasure in them. And I think this kind of goes back to what everyone, just a combination what everyone's saying. The youth is more moldable to a degree. They're more willing to learn, maybe not from parents, but there is more of that fascination with how the world works, and they want to discover it, and the curiosity and so forth. And Solomon makes that point. 1 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 12. Paul told Timothy, let no man despise thy youth. In other words, don't let anyone call you too young. And so the reason it's important for us, even though there aren't Joshes here, but and there's some youth in here, but for the most part, most of us are older in age, is because one, we shouldn't despise the youth of somebody. But two, and I think this is where it's more important, we shouldn't let the youth despise their own youth. Okay? And what I mean by that is how many young individuals don't do something because they think they're too young. And it's going to take somebody who's older, who's more experienced, who has more wisdom to maybe help get them in that position where they have the confidence to do things themselves. Okay?
Well, the older we get, we want to get outside of our comfort zone, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
You sort of get into a rut. And it's very easy. You do it because it's easy. You don't have to learn anything.
Well,
And you just stay in that rut and leave regrets.
And that's an excellent point, because I think when we start to invest in the youth, then that's going to benefit us from that standpoint. It's going to force us almost to get out of that routine in order to help them and impart the wisdom on them. And so, and I'll just say, I do appreciate the investment in the youth here. It's very, when we plan, and when we planned in November, youth was a very high priority on the list. So I'm not trying to say that no one here does. But there is potential in our youth, but it's going to be up to us who are older and more wise to help them meet that potential. We need to be resources upon whom they can lean in order for them to do so. Let's look at some young people in the Bible. It was brought up last week in our area-wide. Greg talked about him, Joseph. Anyone know how old Joseph was when he was over Potiphar's house? Anyone want to guess? 17 years old. 17 years old. So he was sold into slavery and taken to a foreign land as a teenager. Around 16, 17. Turned down the advances of Potiphar's wife at 17 years old. More than likely, before he was 30, he was running Egypt second only to Pharaoh. And so God didn't despise his youth. God didn't look at Joseph as too young. And we know that he was able to preserve his people, preserve the seed promise God had made as a young man. Miriam, Moses' sister. Okay? Moses was put into the Nile when he was a few months old because the decree was that all boys, males under the age of 2 were to be thrown in the river, which I think is ironic. Pharaoh made that decree that all male children under the age of 2 were to be thrown in the river, and parents and into the Nile, and Moses' parents put Moses in the Nile. And I thought that was, curious. They didn't defy, they found a way to work around it. And I think that's another sermon in and of itself, but I just throw it out there, okay? But what happened? Pharaoh's daughter finds Moses, and who is the mediator or the liaison between Pharaoh's daughter and Moses' mother, who essentially gets to raise Moses and get paid to do so? Who was the mediator between that? Miriam. How old was she? Y'all know? Estimates are she was 5 to 7 years older than Moses. This is a 5 to 7 year old girl who recommended to Pharaoh's daughter that she go get her mother to help take care of it. All right. Josiah, King Josiah. I would say arguably, if you want to, apart from David, I think David was the greatest king of Israel. I think from a character standpoint, I think a very close second would be Josiah, if you were to rank them. And y'all know I like to rank things. So King Josiah, great king. Y'all remember how old he was when he became king of Judah? 8 years old. 8 years old when he became king of Judah. 16 when he decided to seek Jehovah. Now, he has a nation that has practiced idolatry for as long as he can remember, yet he's 16 years old when he says we need to go back to God and his commandments. When he turned 20, he initiated a campaign to purge the southern kingdom of all idolatry, 2 Chronicles 34. When I was 20, I was still calling my parents asking for money. Yet here he is leading a spiritual revolution at the age of 20. At 26, he began to restore the kingdom. Josiah is an instance where it angers me. Josiah was a great king. He was so determined on not letting Assyria win that he tries to intercept Egypt and he loses his life. And his rule is cut short because of that. So but all the good he could have possibly done had he lived a little bit longer. But In this, he also restored the Passover to Israel as well, or to Judah. Jeremiah. It's said that Jeremiah's preaching career, or his prophet career, spanned about 60 years. So more than likely, Jeremiah was starting his role as a prophet in the mid to late teen years. Now think about that. You're a teenager and you've got to go tell the people of Israel that if you don't fix your ways, God's going to send an army to destroy you. That's a big message for a teenager. That's a big message for anybody, but that's a very big message for a teenager. Mary, the mother of Jesus, chosen by God to be the one from whom Jesus comes into this world. The incarnate God comes into this world. Any guesses on how old she was? About 15 years old. Luke chapter 1 and verse 46 talks about that song that she wrote. My soul magnifies the Lord, and my spirit hath rejoiced in God my Savior. Luke 1 and verse 46. Harry Rimmer noted that this song, the 10 verses in the English Bible, draws, notice what it says here, from 23 separate passages in the Old Testament. Point being is Mary had a good understanding of the old law, of the Old Testament. And that song that she sang about her being chosen to bring the Messiah into the world contained about 23 portions of the Old Testament. About 15 years old. 15, 16 years old. Now, in Jewish custom at that time, you were considered a woman and old enough to be married and start a family at the age of 13. So our culture's different. So that standard's not acceptable today. But things are different anyway. But back then, 13, so she was about 15, 16 years old. Now, who was heard concerning Joseph, her husband? Who wants to guess at his age? Have you heard the belief or the thought that Joseph was later in years, possibly even up to maybe 25, 30 years older than her? Have y'all heard that? At least, at the very least, in his 20s. Again, we can't know for certain, but it starts to saying the more artifacts and manuscripts we discover, that's actually changed among scholars. And the belief there is that Joseph was actually closer to Mary's age, in the 17, 18, 19-year-old range. All right, those are young. I mean, you look at the character, Joe. If you're 16, 17, 18, 19 years old, and Mary did what she did, before the angel came and spoke to Joseph, what was he going to do? He was going to put her away privately. All right, do you care about someone else's reputation and feelings at 16, 17, 18, 19 years old like that? So Joseph, though young, a man of great character. Timothy, 1 Timothy 4:12, let no man despise thy youth. It is believed that was written about 14 years after Paul joined the apostle. It's believed that he was maybe at the end of his teen years, likely in his early to mid-20s when he began to work with Paul. So this is why I like this verse, because that means when Paul wrote this to Timothy, 14 years after he started working with Timothy was in that 35 to 40-year-old range, and he was still considered a youth in the eyes of culture. And I think we should go back to that. But that's the point. You know, even at 30-something to 40 years old, there were still men who looked at Timothy as too young. And I think we can do that today. Sometimes we just look at those who are younger than us and we want to write them off to a degree. And that's not really how the Bible takes that. Hugo McCord, he's a preacher. He told the story or the instance of a man named Bill Tyner. Bill Tyner wrote the song, "He is my everything." He is my everything, he is my all, he is my everything, both great and small. He gave his life for me, made everything new. He is my everything. Now, how about you? I don't think it's a song most of us have heard. The story behind that song is that Tyner was at a revival gospel meeting type thing, sitting next to a young boy, and simply asked the question, "What does Jesus mean to you?" To which the boy quickly responded, "Why, he's my everything. What does he mean to you?" And that conversation with that 12-year-old boy motivated him, moved him to write that song. And so youth, age, we hear the adage, age is nothing but a number. There are some instances where age is important. You look at the qualifications for an elder. There has to be some age because of some of the things that have to be accomplished before that. But the point being is we look at children and we make the argument that this is the future of the church. And there is a sense where that is true. But they're also part of the church today. There's still value in their youth now. Now, yes, they are the future leaders of the church. They are the ones who one day will be in charge. But they're still part of the church today. And there's still value in them as well. So we want to keep that in mind. All right, so if we're going to help our youth, contribute to the Lord's work, here's some things we want to do based on what David did. David used his past to get to his future. Okay, remember here in 1 Samuel 17, when he was trying to convince Saul to let him go fight Goliath, what case did he make? What was his argument? Okay. Right. In my father's fields, I fought a bear and I fought a lion. The Lord protected me then. He's going to protect me now. So he looked back at his past and he took inventory of what God had done, and that gave him the confidence to do what he did against Goliath. And I would even argue that gave him the confidence to persevere while he was being pursued by Saul. And that even gave him the confidence to persevere when he was being pursued by Absalom later in his life. All right, so that's something that all of us can do, not just the youth. We can all look back on our past, take inventory, and then use that to move forward in the future. That's the thought behind Romans 15:4. Whatsoever things were written aforetime were written for our learning, that through patience and comfort the scriptures might have hope. And so David used his own skills to accomplish the great task. All right, David was given the option of wearing the armor of Saul, probably taking the weaponry of Saul into battle, but what did he choose? He chose what he was most familiar with. In fact, and we'll talk about this in just a minute, in fact, when he hits Goliath with the rock and he goes down to the body of Goliath, what does he use to cut off the head of Goliath? Goliath's sword. Probably because he didn't have one. He probably had just that sling. And so he had to use Goliath's sword to actually behead him. The sling is not a weak weapon. I would argue that him taking that sling, I'll say this is that year's version of bringing a gun to a knife fight. If you want, the sling was probably the closest to a gun that they had at that time. Judges 20 and verse 6 talks about a group of individuals that could split a hair with the sling. So it was a skilled weapon of the time, and so David used what he was most familiar with in order to fight Goliath. I think we can learn from that from the standpoint of determine, one, lets us as individuals assess our skills. But two, let's help our youth assess their skills. All right, it's usually we identify and recognize things because of our experience and wisdom in the youth that they may not see in themselves. And so one, let's help them assess their skills. Two, let's help them determine how those skills can be utilized for good. All right, we want to do it for ourselves. If I know that I can do this, that I'm skilled at this, then how can I use this to the betterment of God's work and His glory? Okay? And then, once we do that, then let's look at our children and our youth. And let's help them assess what they do well, and then help them try and find a way to help or utilize it in God. I'm going to be honest with you. Social media is here. It's not going away. And the youth are way better at it than at least I am. All right? I think that's an avenue that the church can take advantage of. And just to be honest, it's going to be the youth that help us do that. And so that's a tool that we can use. Number 3, David gave God the glory. Okay, so there is a facet where David had to use his skills and use his knowledge and expertise to defeat Goliath, but at the same time, he gave God the glory. Verse 45 of 1 Samuel 17. Then David said to the Philistine, "You come at me with sword and with a spear and with the javelin, but I come to you with my sling." Is that what he said? No, he said, I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defiled. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air, to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Now, if you're Goliath, and you're a grown man, and you've been fighting wars, and this 20-year-old kid comes out and tells you this, how are you going to take that? I imagine it rubbed Goliath the wrong way, but and again, I don't think these are the words of a 12-year-old kid. I don't think a 12-year-old is going to have that type of confidence in this situation. If he was, that would be a special 12-year-old, but even at 20, it takes a lot of gumption, or even 25. David proved himself through obedience. Look at verse 20. It says, "And David rose early in the morning and left the sheep with a keeper and took the provisions and went, as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the encampment as the host was going out to battle, shouting the war cry." So Jesse tells him to take provisions to his brothers and to bring back a report. And in verse 20 here, it says that he rose early. All right, so in 20 years old, if you would have asked me to do something, even just something as minimal as taking out the trash, what happened? I procrastinated on that as long as I possibly could. So here we see, even at this young age, according to Saul, there was still obedience involved. And again, when we're helping our youth, complimenting, encouraging them is definitely something that's going to help give them the confidence to continue to do it. But there may be an instance where, for lack of a better term, they just need to be humbled to a degree. Who better to do that? Someone their own age? Someone outside of the church? Life in general? Or somebody who's wiser, who's patient, and does it with love and compassion and more gently than maybe others will. And so, again, it's not just the youth that need to hear this. Are our youth going to suffer persecution? I think of John Mark. Remember in Acts, he left, probably a youthful decision. I would imagine John Mark later in his life regretted leaving the mission field. Criticized by who? By Paul, the Apostle Paul. So what would you say is the contributing factor in John Mark being A, useful to Paul, which Paul says in his letter to Timothy, bring John Mark because he's useful to me, and 2, he wrote the second gospel account in our Bibles as far as order goes. What do you think contributed to that? You think it was just a stubborn, hard-headed nature of John Mark, or what? Paul, but before that, when Paul was criticizing John Mark, who was there? Barnabas. All right, so our youth are going to face persecution. And so I think we develop relationships with them, then that's going to give them the confidence. I don't know the situation, but I would imagine John Mark leaned on Barnabas during difficult times. And whether Mark knew what Paul said about him, Barnabas knew, yet he still took him and still worked with him. So, rock solid faith. David had rock solid faith. And we see that throughout his life. I can't help but think that everything David endured as a king, I wonder how many times he looked back at that moment against Goliath as a source of motivation to continue on and to persevere. I know David was a man of great faith when he went to fight Goliath, but you know that the faith of David had to grow exponentially after that battle. And so, and then David confidently faced the giant. And again, from a youth perspective, and I think that is one of the attributes of youth, is there is a, what's the word I want to say? I don't want to say unfounded confidence, but their confidence level is definitely probably outweighs their sometimes capability, experience. They don't know any better, if that makes sense. They don't know that they're too young to not do these things. They don't know that their youth is supposed to be a hindrance to them. And so we can help them garner that confidence. I think that's a great attribute in the youth, and I think it's something we don't want to suppress their confidence. We want to, and Carly says this all the time, we want to guide it. We want to push it. We want to point it in the right direction, but we don't want to hold them back. We don't want to suppress it, but we want to point it where it should go. And so, so that being said, anytime, and just what are some practical ways, with all that in mind, what are some practical ways that y'all think we can develop our youth?
Say no as little as possible.
Very good. I like that. Saying now, no is sometimes an answer that has to be said, but it should be a last resort. Can we guide it? It may not be perfect, so how can we make this request a yes, if that makes sense? Very good. Ms. Regina?
Just let them take on some responsibility.
Absolutely. Give them responsibility. If you are over something, whatever it is, and one thing about the evangelism program, I would highly encourage is bring your kids to write cards. That's something they can do. That's something they enjoy. And I promise you that the person who receives the cards, those children's cards, stick out more than probably something that I'm writing. Becky?
Teach them to pray about the decisions they make.
Excellent point. You are never too young to pray. And again, this goes back to what we were talking about from the standpoint of our habits, our character is formed during our youth. Those are formidable years. So stress prayer. And because if they become people of prayer in their youth, then that's a habit that's going to carry on as they get older. What else?
I think we have to fulfill our end of what Scripture calls us to. The older are supposed to teach the younger. On the other side, like I think about the way that Paul taught Timothy and mentored him, and the women specifically, the older are called to mentor and guide the younger.
That's a great point. One, take that mentorship role. Two, make sure you are worthy of taking on the role of mentor. All right, nothing worse than a hypocrite trying to teach you to do something or tell you to do something. So there is a facet where we have to work on ourselves first and put ourselves in a position to help those. But very good. Anyone else? Yes, ma'am.
Well, I believe that they should be encouraged to follow through at home the things that they're taught here in the congregation, just like the writing of the cards, that needs to be done at home individually. When they pray, continue praying, have them lead prayers at home. And when their friends are sick, call them up, encourage them to call their friends. Just keep in mind the things as adults do, which this is part of the mentoring, that the children can do too. It doesn't matter how young they are.
Very good point. Very good point.
Great. They just make me smile with them.
That's a great point. So if you do something to the service of God at home, include your children in it as well. Mike, did you have something?
Yeah, I've been thinking this whole time about, Jesus at the age of 12 said, I have to be about my Father's business. But he was 30 years old before he actually started his ministry. So I think one thing we need to teach our youth is to be patient and wait. And, when you gain a little bit of knowledge, don't just assume that you know all of the answers. It's something that takes a while.
Very good point. Mike said, if you didn't hear it, instill patience in them. Jesus knew he was to be about his Father's business at age 12, but his ministry didn't start until John chapter 2 with the first miracle at the age of 30. And so there's patience. So yes, we want to encourage them, but at the same time, we want to put things in a legitimate perspective. Be realistic. Let them shoot for the stars, but have that dose of reality. Anyone else? Very good comments. Thank you for your participation. And hopefully Chris is back next week.